Welcome to this evening's annual lecture, which in 2018 is going to be focusing on gorilla conservation. Now, FFI has a long history of working on the conservation of great apes, and that includes work on orangutan in Borneo, on chimpanzees in West Africa, and on the work on the mountain and lowland gorillas in Central Africa that we'll be hearing a little bit more about later on. And within our species portfolio, these represent charismatic conservation flagships that are important as a focus not only for their own conservation, but for work to conserve the habitat that they depend on and that many other species depend on too. Now, our work with mountain gorilla conservation began in 1978, when our now FFI Vice President, Sir David Attenborough, came to FFI with a request for help. He'd recently been filming those iconic footage from the BBC series Life on Earth, which we'll all be very familiar with, which he'd been doing with the renowned conservationist Dian Fossey, a great gorilla champion, as you all know. Soon after David came back from that expedition, he got word from Dian that one of the gorillas had been killed, and she made a plea to David for his help, and he in turn came to FFI. And as a result of that, we created what has now become the International Gorilla Conservation Program, IGCP, which we created and supported together with our partner WWF, and which has become a real force for gorilla conservation and has helped to reverse the declining trend in that particular species. Tonight, we are honoured to be able to have first-hand accounts from the field from two very dedicated and experienced gorilla conservationists. First, we'll be hearing from the current director of IGCP, Anna Ben-Masazera, who's joining us from Rwanda. And following that, we'll be hearing from Anjali Todd. Both of them, Anna and Anjali, have many, many years of dedicated conservation experience working with gorillas. Now, before I introduce and welcome Anna to the stage, we have a video from one of our current FFI council members, Annette Lan Yao. Now, Annette is another great example of a life dedicated to conservation. For over 20 years, she's been focusing on research and conservation of the ecology and behavior of gorillas and other great apes. That goes back to early work she did with bonobos, and moving on from that to a stint as a prior director of IGCP for 15 years, and following on from that into her current position with the Arcus Foundation, a great supporter of FFI's work. She couldn't be with us tonight, but she wanted to share her thoughts on gorilla conservation, and so we are lucky enough now to have some video footage and a few words from Annette, which I hope you'll enjoy.
When you spend time with, for example, gorillas, and you get to know the individuals and you get to understand their behavior, there's something that is so attractive and fascinating about these animals. And it makes you care very deeply, not just about the species, but about those individuals and those animals that you get to know. And I think that doesn't ever let you go. They are extremely intelligent, they are very social, they think and devise solutions to problems that they are faced with, and it's understanding how they do that in a complex environment and in an environment that's changing over time. And so how do they adapt? How do they learn? How do they manage to continue to survive? And how are they suffering? And what can we do in order to ensure that their protection is more effective? Those are the kind of questions that aren't going to stop. The biggest challenge is habitat conversion. It's the destruction of their habitat, the forests. And that's for a number of purposes. Probably the biggest one is for agricultural conversion. But another huge challenge, and this is one that has been talked about less in recent times, but is really starting to come to a head now, and that's infrastructure development. So the initiatives to build roads, bridges, dams, and all sorts of infrastructure projects into areas that up until now have been relatively remote. And so there's an extraction of resources from the forest, and then there's an entry of people that comes with the opening up of the forest that leads to the destruction of the forest and the wildlife. The thing that we have to remember, though, is that although we often look at the challenges at a local level, We see a road coming into the forest and then farmers following that road or hunters following that road. We have to remember, why is that road being built? And that's because of extraction by companies coming from outside of that country and demand for resources from outside of that country. So protecting it locally and preventing people from going and following, that's not going to solve the problem. What you need to do is change consumer practice in wealthy countries. I think the opportunities are first to embrace that complexity, to recognize that this is complex. There's no one simple single solution that's going to solve all the problems of the world. In addition, we have to look at it from a holistic perspective and really understand how interconnected everything is. And in order to do that, organizations need to work together. They need to each bring their area of expertise, and not just scientific or conservation expertise, but link with health and link with development and link with economics and link with philosophy and psychology and all of those things. Work together and think holistically. So where I am the most excited and the most positive is that that's happening. The fact that these organizations have come together, are pooling their resources and their expertise, and are collaborating and thinking together about the big picture in a holistic way is very encouraging. The mountain gorillas are and remain in a perilous situation, but because conservation efforts have been so effective, not only has that population decline stabilized, it's actually reversed and the population has increased. So I think that this is something that FFI can justly take real satisfaction in. We need to actually recognize that these forests need to remain protected. That doesn't mean people don't get to live near them or use them or benefit from what they offer. What it means is we have to do it in a really deliberate, thoughtful, and careful way. We need more data, more monitoring, more protection on the ground, much more work with local communities to secure their rights, and then a completely revised way of thinking about development and changing the way in which we extract resources to feed this hungry beast of consumption around the world. A lot of the messaging that comes from conservationists can be really overwhelming and daunting, and sometimes sound so big and so complicated and so difficult that it almost seems like, what can we do? I'm powerless to do anything to change this. But I also think that there are so many fantastic examples of where conservation has really worked. And I think we all need to take encouragement from that. But most of all, I think we need to take encouragement from the incredible people who are making this happen. Individuals who are dedicating their lives to making conservation work and protecting areas and protecting species. And I think one of the main reasons why they do that, yes, in our heads we know it's necessary for our planetary survival, but in our hearts we care. We care about these animals, we care about these beautiful places. There's something so incredibly beautiful and so vulnerable and precious about these animals. So I think my message is that we all have a role to play in protecting it and maintaining it. Whether it's big or small, whether it takes your whole life or whether it takes 5 minutes, there's something that we can all do to protect something that is so precious and so beautiful.
We are at FFI incredibly privileged to have the benefits of Annette's experience, her insights, and her advice for the work that we do. Now, it's my great privilege to invite Anna Ben-Masazera to the stage now. Anna joined IGCP in 2010 and very quickly became director. And in that role since 2013, she's been taking the organization from strength to strength, developing new strategies, forging new collaborations, working incredibly effectively with partners like FFI and WWF in changing circumstances for gorilla conservation across its entire transboundary range in Central Africa. So please join me in welcoming Anna.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to FFI for inviting me here today. It's really an honor and a privilege on behalf of my whole team back in Africa to be here. It's also really nice to see a lot of familiar faces who have been part of our journey for a long time, and also a lot of new faces as well. For the purposes of my talk, like the work of IGCP, I will stay focused on mountain gorillas, who live in two isolated subpopulations at the intersection of Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The transboundary Virungas, located in the south of this map, an area of 451 square kilometers, and Bwindi Impenetrable National Park, an area of 331 square kilometers. These are national parks, some recognized by UNESCO as Man and Biosphere Reserves, and World Heritage Sites. As mentioned by our previous speaker, the story of mountain gorilla is one of recovery. This graph depicts estimates of the two subpopulations from surveys conducted over the last 4 decades. It's important to note that the trend is also a story of advanced survey methods, like the introduction of non-invasive genetic analysis and simply more survey effort. But we are sure, by analyzing these results in detail, that the subpopulations are in fact growing. Earlier this year, the 3 range states announced the new figures from the most recent survey conducted in the Virungas, 604 known individuals. And when combined with the last estimate from Bwindi, this tips the number of mountain gorillas just beyond 1,000, the highest ever recorded number. This is an incredible collective achievement, especially considering mountain gorillas were believed to be on the brink of extinction 4 decades earlier. At the time, with growing direct threats, as Matt discussed, and the gorilla's habitat being converted to pyrethrum and potato fields. We're now busy with the data and sample collection in Bwindi, and when the analysis is complete, we'll add another orange donut to this graph. So how was this achieved? As mentioned, FFI, through the Mountain Gorilla Project and subsequently the International Gorilla Conservation Program, starting all the way back in the late 1970s, has played an important role in this story. IGCP in itself, as a program of multiple conservation organizations, has demonstrated by example the power and potential of collaboration, of working together. Here you see rangers from DRC and Rwanda exhibiting the mini rope snares they destroyed through joint patrols. IGCP has taken a lead on conservation diplomacy and facilitating both informal and formal transboundary collaboration, which is now led by the states themselves. In fact, in 2015, the Greater Virunga Transboundary Treaty was signed by these 3 states, formalizing their collective commitment to work together for wildlife conservation and tourism development. Cooperation across borders facilitates gorilla and habitat monitoring, including all of those surveys that were represented on that graph. The teams that conduct these surveys are comprised of Congolese, Rwandans, and Ugandans from more than 10 different institutions and organizations, working together in a coordinated effort. The relationships built among individuals and organizations last well beyond the collection of that last data point. So how many people in this room have actually spent time with mountain gorillas? Can I have a show of hands? Very nice. So your visits and the visits by many more have actually played a significant role in the mountain gorilla story. IGCP has been there throughout, along with the private sector, promoting regulated tourism as a conservation tool. And tourism has in fact yielded benefits in terms of direct protection and monitoring, as well as making the financial argument for the existence of gorillas, both at the national and local levels. From day one, IGCP and its predecessor projects have been engaging the people living around mountain gorilla parks as gorilla protectors. As mountain gorilla tourism grew over time, we have supported the development of policies which share revenue generated from park entrance, as well as tourism enterprise like these artisans. To give you an idea of the scale of this in terms of revenue sharing from park entrance, over 1 million British pounds was used to fund over 300 projects around Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda alone through tourism revenue sharing over the last decade. And in Uganda, revenue sharing is also complemented by what's now known as the gorilla levy, increasing that pot of money which goes back to these gorilla protectors. While this year has given us cause to celebrate, it is important to keep in mind that these two subpopulations are still small and vulnerable to decline due to disease or the impacts of climate change on their habitat, as well as the human response to climate change. To give you just an idea of where mountain gorillas are headed, this was an analysis we did of relative habitat use by mountain gorillas in 2 time series, 2004 to 2008 on the left and 2009 to 2014 on the right, with the dark blue-gray color representing more gorillas using a particular area. This data is relevant for Rwanda side only. And in fact, we found in 2015 and 2016 that gorillas continue to expand their use of the habitat within these protected areas, the black dots being gorilla signs and the shading related to sign per hectare, with some areas becoming very dense with overlapping gorilla groups. While mountain gorillas are the most rigorously studied subspecies, especially at the individual and group level for some of these gorillas, there is still much to learn and understand about whole population dynamics. Today we're fortunate. We know so much more from these surveys and other monitoring techniques like camera trapping about mountain gorillas, including those gorillas that aren't monitored on a daily basis. Digging deeper into the understanding of population dynamics is where we need to invest so that we can use good evidence to guide our work going forward. Those same surveys, along with remote sensing technology, have gotten us very close to an excellent map of vegetation within these protected areas at a 15 to 20 meter resolution. Taking all these rich data sources, IGCP is working on niche models for mountain gorillas and other key species that share their habitat, like elephants, and will be supporting institutions with a mountain gorilla population viability and habitat assessment to have a better understanding of what effect different management scenarios might have on the future. And now we are facing a big challenge, factoring in the needs of a growing mountain gorilla population, as well as a growing human population. An estimated 500,000 people live near mountain gorilla parks and are dependent upon subsistence and commercial agriculture. While those living near the parks do access revenue-sharing funds, they also struggle with losses from wildlife, not necessarily gorillas, but golden and blue monkeys, bush pigs, chimps, baboons, elephants, and buffalo that share their habitat. These losses coming from crop loss from wildlife feeding on their crops. In fact, the bulk of respondents of a survey commissioned by IGCP had respondents, over half of respondents, indicating the biggest cost at both the personal and community level being that human-wildlife conflict. Reconciling these, therefore, is a critical issue, and this calls for a coherent approach, using strategies which make these protected areas as much like an island as possible to address crop raiding and manage outside impacts on the park, and as well as little as an island as possible to ensure sufficient habitat for key species and mitigate impact from climate change. We're working to address this at landscape scale, ensuring the rights and engagement of people in the process. The results of the last survey also point to another critical issue, that despite all the incredible efforts in both improved law enforcement and community engagement and benefit sharing, The level of snares, these wire or rope traps that are set by people targeting antelopes, but also don't discriminate with gorillas, this has not reduced over the same time period. So what you see here on the map in red are hotspot areas where we have high gorilla density and high snare density. And you'll also note that on the map, while the teams were out there doing the survey, they did find a gorilla who was dead in one of those snares. So we need to have a better understanding of why this continues to be a persistent issue and improve our strategies. It's also important to note that with illegal wildlife trade in the region and globally, we need to recognize that the context is changing around us, and different sites and different species are being targeted. It is not out of the realm of possibility that our reasonably protected areas where mountain gorillas exist could be under new threats. We also need to get tourism right. For gorillas, getting this right is by ensuring that visits are done according to precautionary principles and IUCN best practice standards to reduce and mitigate those potential negative risks to mountain gorillas as much as possible. This will help reduce those risks from disease and behavior change by including having a limited number of people, one visit per day lasting no more than 1 hour, and inclusive of managing respectable distance and use of barriers like masks. We need to incorporate these principles into all aspects of tourism development, marketing and management. Tourists and tour operators, as well as park authorities, have a role to play. Gorilla-friendly tourism is also about the human side of tourism, ensuring transparency, inclusion, and equity in the way benefits from tourism are accessible to those who live around the park. And in fact, some research shows that lack of equity on how those benefits are shared is the reason why those snares continue to be placed in the mountain gorilla habitat. Going forward, we need as well to orient the resources to those households most closely associated with the gorillas in the parks, rather than general social services, where the resources have largely been channeled to date. There's a lot of work to be done here, not directly by IGCP itself, but by empowering community groups and other civil society organizations to monitor and advocate for improved governance. IGCP will continue to evolve and adapt ourselves to the context and work in tandem with all actors toward this common goal. Thank you for being part of this, and thank you for continuing with us to the next chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for such a rich and detailed presentation. I feel certain there are going to be many questions when we come to that stage of the evening a little later on. From my side, it's really inspiring to hear a story which may still have a lot of challenges, but at the heart of it is a real story of success and positivity. I started earlier this evening talking about pessimism in conservation, and it's so often that we see the headline story, one where the graph is going that way. And so it's really, really heartening to see one where in fact that headline story at the heart of this is one that's really beginning to do that. So thank you very much for sharing it. Unlike some of you in the audience, I have not yet had the opportunity to go and see the gorillas. Perhaps after this evening I will get my invitation, who knows.
Yes.
In fact, Anna's team in Rwanda, they took with them one of FFI's vice presidents, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall. Now, Hugh couldn't be here this evening, but he very much wanted to give you a message directly from the field.
I'm Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, and I'm a Vice President of Fauna Flora International, and I'm speaking to you from Rwanda, where I'm finding out about the work that FFI is doing with the mountain gorillas here. I've been absolutely blown away by the experience, not just seeing these wonderful animals, but also finding out about the fantastic conservation work that has really reversed the fortunes of these beautiful great apes. I'm having the most fantastic time with this beautiful gorilla family here today. And that's only possible because this is such a great conservation success story. The most recent census put the total number of mountain gorillas at over 1,000. 1,004 known individuals have been recognised and registered, and the hope is that there may be quite a few more. And that's up from a low of less than 400 40 years ago, so it really is a fantastic success. But there's still so much more to do if we're going to ensure the long-term survival of these incredible animals. It feels like a good moment to say thank you for your support for the work that Fauna and Flora International is doing with these mountain gorillas. And if you're new to FFI, please think about getting involved, make a donation or join as a member, and you'll be joining one of the most effective conservation teams in the world, supporting not just the mountain gorillas, but endangered species all over the planet.
We're going to move on now for the next part of this evening from the mountain gorillas to one of their nearby cousins. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome Anjali Todd to the stage to talk to us a little bit about the work that she's been involved in with FFI. Now, Anjali has 20 years' experience working with the Western Lowland gorillas in the Central African Republic and Gabon before she joined FFI around about a year ago. Now, amongst the various things that Angelique is doing in her role at FFI is focusing on taking our conservation work with Grauer's gorillas to the next stage of its evolution. Angelique, over to you.
Thank you very much and good evening. So before I start, I think Matt mentioned that I'm fairly new to FFI. I've only been there for a year and working in this landscape in particular. And I would like to acknowledge those FFI staff that came before me, in particular Thalia Liakardis, Stuart Nixon, and our country manager, Siva Mbake. There are also some people in this room that have many years of experience in the region. So to start, to expand a little bit on my background, the first gorilla I got to know was Jum, when I started working at Howlett's and Port Lim in 1991. Born in the wild, Jum came to the zoo as an infant in 1970 and grew to be one of the largest captive gorillas at that time. We were approximately the same age, and it was fascinating getting to know this powerful yet gentle individual. And never once did I feel threatened by him, and indeed, given the chance, he used to pluck my eyelashes one by one from my eyes, which is not something that would be encouraged today. Sadly, Jum died of cardiac disease before he was 30, which is frequently the case for adult male captive gorillas. In 1998, I got my first chance, my break, to go out to Africa and going out to Central African Republic as a research assistant. I went for 6 months and I stayed for 15 years. I spent most of this time habituating gorillas for research and tourism. Habituation, in a nutshell, being the process of getting animals used to human presence. It was then that I got my title of being gorilla whisperer. You missed that out.
I was saving
and I started whispering to those gorillas, yes. Thus, I gradually got to know my first wild gorilla group named Makumba, after its silverback. And this is the beautiful Makumba. And when I first started habituating Makumba in 2000, he already had 4 to 5 females and around 3 infants. And we estimated his age to be around 22 years old. And 18 years later, after siring 16 offspring, 12 of which are surviving, his group today consists of 2 females and 4 remaining offspring, 2 of them twins born in 2016. Unfortunately, I left in CAR in 2013 with my young daughter during a particularly violent coup, and then spent almost 5 years in Gabon, during which I advised the Gabonese wildlife authorities on developing gorilla tourism in Gabon. So I would like to start this with to give you a brief biology lesson on gorillas. for those of you who don't know. So there are two species of gorillas, Western and Eastern, and they're genetically distinct. And each species has two subspecies, and all are critically endangered with similar threats of habitat loss, poaching, and disease. Within the Western species, the Western Lowland gorilla is the most numerous, numbering around 360,000 individuals from recent analysis, and ranging in about 700,000 kilometers squared over 6 countries. This is a subspecies that are found in zoos across the world, and as their name depicts, they live in lowland forests. The other Western species are cross-river gorillas. These are the rarest gorillas, estimated at only 250 to 300 individuals living in lowland to submontane habitats on the Nigerian-Cameroonian border in a range of about 12,000 kilometers squared. Then we have, of the eastern species, the most well-known gorillas are the mountain gorillas, which Anna has just been talking about, living in just 780 kilometers squared of montane habitat on the borders of Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC. And as Anna announced, mountain gorillas have gradually increased over the years, and they now just number over 1,000 gorillas. Lastly, we have the eastern lowland gorilla, or what's now known more as Grauer's gorilla. They're relatively little studied. They're endemic to the lowland and highland habitats of eastern DRC. And their numbers and range have plummeted over the last 20 years. So there are now only 300 and 800 gorillas remaining in about 20,000 kilometers squared. So there are some basic similarities amongst all these subspecies. For instance, generally all the subspecies have an average group size of about 10. However, there are also some differences which have a knock-on effect on their socioecology. Gorillas, for instance, are basically herbivorous, but where they live in the lowland habitats, so in part the Cross River, definitely the Western Lowlands, and the Grauer's gorillas, they also incorporate fruit into their diets. And unlike abundant herbivorous vegetation, fruit is found in patches, and this creates competition both within groups and between groups, placing limitations on their maximum group size, how cohesive the groups are, how far they walk each day, and how large their home ranges are. Thus, whilst mountain gorillas have been found in groups with up to 65 individuals, nevertheless, their groups remain quite cohesive and they have smaller home ranges, whereas Western lowland gorillas rarely surpass 20 individuals, have larger home ranges, and sometimes the group can be split, so you'll find group members hundreds of meters apart in their search for fruit or other food. Additionally, mountain gorilla groups can be multi-male, meaning they have multiple silverbacks in the groups, whereas the other subspecies tend to be exclusively one-male groups. This means that for the 3 subspecies with one-male groups, there are many other low males in the environment all trying to find females, and this creates another type of competition. And as a consequence of these competitive influences, subspecies such as Western gorillas tend to be, or I think, a little bit more aggressive than, for instance, their frequently depicted gentle mountain cousins. I won't go into further detail, but an important point to take home is that there is a degree of ecological flexibility within gorilla subspecies that has allowed them to adapt to a variety of habitats, from the coastal forests in Gabon to the mountain habitats of Rwanda. So today I'm going to focus on Grauer's gorillas and FFI's work with Grauer's gorillas. They were first surveyed in the 1950s by Emlen and Schaller and estimated between 5,000 and 15,000 gorillas. And the population then was already very fragmented and highly threatened. And in the 1960s to 80s, habitat conversion intensified, and there was widespread killing of gorillas, not only for bushmeat, but also in retaliation for crop raiding. In 1994, in this already fragile region, it was destabilized by the Rwandan civil war and genocide, when thousands of refugees came over the border into DRC, and with internally displaced people, put a lot of pressure and increased pressure on natural resources. And during this period, there was another survey by Jefferson Hall and others, and they estimated around 17,000 individuals of Grauer's gorillas, and always remaining highly threatened. From 1996 to 2003, the DRC civil wars took the crisis to new heights with heightened insecurity, increased bushmeat hunting and deforestation, and occupation of the parks by militia. An estimated 5 million people were killed. This conflict was partly fueled by the global demand for minerals such as coltan, wolframite, gold, tin, and these were protected by local rebel factions and military, and that remains the case to today. And this ready access to firearms facilitated the bushmeat hunting and to feed the miners in these remote areas. And gorillas are a very favoured species and very attractive to be hunted, as they provide a large amount of meat and they're easy to track. At this time, it was already becoming very clear that Grauers had been impacted by all the conflict in the region, and they knew numbers had plunged, but they didn't know the magnitude. So in any case, in the mid-2000s, efforts were made to create Eastern DRC's first community-managed reserves, such as Taina and Usala. Towards the end of the 2000s, a coordinated effort was made by a consortium of international NGOs and local NGOs, including FFI, to conserve Grauers gorillas. And this effort led to the first Eastern DRC Great Ape Conservation Action Plan, or CAP, as it's known. This included not only Grauers gorillas, but Eastern gorillas as well. This not only included Grauers gorillas, but also chimpanzees. And from this led to the initial mapping and a new range-wide assessment of Grauers. This was carried out by trained community members and park rangers from the Congolese wildlife authorities, also known as ICCN. So in this conservation action plan, 4 regions were described as priority regions. The first is Maiko, which is here depicted in yellow. Then there's Taina Usala in orange, Kahuzi Kasese in blue, and then Itombwe Massif in purple. And in this map, you can see the national parks. They're actually the green is overlaid by the other colors, but this is Maiko National Park, around 10,000 kilometers squared. This is Kahuzi Biega, which has a lowland section, which is in the brown, and a highland section. This is about 6,000 kilometers squared. And then here you can also see the Virunga landscape. When the Conservation Action Plan partners overlaid the threats in this landscape, it completely overlapped with the Grauers range. So in red here are the areas of high insecurity and hunting, and the yellow areas are medium insecurity and hunting. So across the Grauers range. So the range-wide surveys were led by WCS and FFI. And for those interested, this publication can easily be found on the internet. It was also published in the online journal PLOS. So this middle map indicates the gorilla observations. And this map represents the modelled occupancy of Grauers gorillas in the region. And when they did this, they found that the gorillas, and again, this is Maiko National Park and this is Kahuzi Biega. So most of the gorillas were outside of the national parks. I'm not the expert on this. In fact, I think the expert is in the room. This is Andy Plumtree. Maybe you can talk to him later. But this analysis led to the assessment that there was a 77% range-wide decline in Grauers gorillas, which is a 5% loss every year. There was thus an evident need to protect gorillas both inside and outside the protected areas in a connected landscape. And without action, many of these sites would lose Grauers gorillas in 2 to 5 years. And in fact, Grauers gorillas are classified as one of the world's 25 most endangered primates. So this paints rather a bleak picture, as Matt was saying, but there is also hope, and this lies with the coordinated efforts of the consortium of Conservation Action Plan partners and efforts to engage communities in remote areas of the Grauers range. So there has been success in that the 2016 publication of the surveys has led to Grauer's gorillas being reclassified as critically endangered. And then between 2014 and 16, there's been increase in the conservation presence by the wildlife authorities in a number of areas that are important for Grauer's gorillas. There has also been regular community-based gorilla monitoring that has been established in a number of the reserves. So 2 of these reserves are where FFI has focused its efforts since 2012. So these are the areas where FFI works, to the west of Maiko National Park, and then we have some sort of low-key, small-scale activities adjacent to Kahuzi National Park. The 2 reserves are named Regulu and Regamuki, act as a buffer to Maiko, most of which Maiko, which is just here, remains inaccessible due to the long-term presence of Simba rebels. Regulu is approximately 500 kilometers squared, and Regamuki is double the size at around 1,000 kilometers squared. The challenges in this area are very similar to across the rest of the landscape. There's insecurity, agricultural land clearance and encroachment, mining, poaching, illegal fishing with poisons. And whenever you have humans and apes in the same landscape, there's always also the risk of disease. This map also shows the many villages that are adjacent to the 2 reserves, and an estimate of the population in this area is 258,000 people. So FFI supports the reserve management committees to manage these reserves, and a principal activity is supporting community-led biomonitoring and law enforcement. And without a close relationship with the communities, we wouldn't be able to work in these reserves. And so working with the communities has allowed us to locate gorilla groups as well as mitigate conflict. So the surveys in 2010 in Regulu in particular revealed really no gorillas left. But by working with the local hunters and other forest users, the teams were able to identify where the gorilla groups were found, and those are the groups that we do follow today. Additionally, these rangers work in tough conditions and are unarmed, and thus they have a limited capacity to disarm more heavily armed poachers and dismantle mines. And being local, they're usually acquainted with the forest users and are effective in mitigating conflict and raising awareness. So this is a photo of 3 of our biomonitoring and law enforcement teams who work in the reserves. There are a total of 6 teams. And this is an example of, firstly, on the first row, gorilla signs. So that's a gorilla dung, which anybody who studies gorillas spends a lot of time with. And then there's a tree nest, a ground nest. And then the bottom 2 rows depict mining, bushmeat, snares, fishing, an illegal mining camp, which can have people, up to 200 people in one camp. And this is a poached okapi. So these next 2 maps are maps of where the gorillas are found in the reserve. It's not very scientific. The red circles depict an approximate 40 or maximum home range that a gorilla group could have. And by doing some kind of mutually exclusive exercise, you can come up with a number of groups, looking also at the nest group sizes. So this is Regulu, where we monitor approximately 10 groups. And this is Regamuki, where there are another approximately 10 groups. Now, these areas don't represent the total distribution of gorillas within these reserves, because in fact, these maps actually represent where the patrols go and find gorillas. In the rest of the areas, for instance, in Regamuki, these areas are not patrolled, and that's because we don't have enough teams. So they're likely to be, despite normally having a fragmented distribution, there are likely to be more gorillas in this population. In total, the number of gorillas is estimated between 80 and 90. You might think that this is quite small, but these populations are very important because they connect up myco with those, if you remember earlier on the map with the concentrated blue of gorillas. And a recent paper has shown that these peripheral populations are very important genetically to making sure the populations are viable. So on the other side of the coin, the communities also have to see the benefit and value in conserving their forests. And to this end, we also work with the Reglu and Regamuki communities to improve their livelihoods and support sustainable natural resource use. We're training them to build energy-efficient stoves. These have been shown to reduce wood consumption by 30% and thus reduce deforestation. And they have other health benefits such as less smoke, and for the women, there are cleaner pots and more efficient cooking. And then we've also been carrying out baseline studies on non-forest timber projects, crops, agricultural practices and markets, and we doing this with the aim of developing sustainable livelihoods in the future. So what about the future? So the insecurity and the associated activities, that is hunting and mining, remain the most significant threat to Grauer's gorillas. The DRC government, of course, must increase the security of the area, but of course we've got elections coming up, possibly in December. But one also needs to recognise that with increased security comes increased development, and that has its own challenges. So both reserves where we work are vulnerable to further disturbance and habitat conversion, and there is an urgent need to build on the current activities to promote gorilla and human coexistence and ensure connectivity. Obviously, long-term monitoring and protection of priority populations is kind of top on the list. FFI's 5-year goal is to secure the protection of stable population of grouse gorillas in the areas where we work. And this will include increasing support not only to the wildlife authorities, but also to the communities for biomonitoring and law enforcement. There is also a need to work with extractive, we will also be supporting local communities to establish sustainably managed, legally recognised community forests. Reglu and Regamuki will be divided into 3 community forests to promote ownership and maintain habitat connectivity. There is also a need to work with extractive industries to regulate mining, disarm miners, identify ape-friendly practices. FFI doesn't at present work in this area, but we do hope by supporting sustainable livelihood opportunities, we hope to improve and stabilise incomes. So mining is very hard and dirty work, and whilst it might be lucrative, it doesn't necessarily produce regular income. So we're hoping that other livelihoods can have a more stable and a better lifestyle. And such livelihoods will include incorporating conservation agriculture and agroforestry to reduce itinerant agriculture and reduce deforestation, and also looking at the development of markets of selected products to improve household revenue and act as an incentive for sustainable natural resource use. Lastly, we will continue to increase local, national and international awareness with targeted awareness campaigns that not only increase knowledge but also promote behavioural change. And finally, what have we learnt? So most of the gorillas, the Grouse gorillas, are found outside of protected areas, over vast areas, and community engagement and coordinated efforts ensuring connectivity are vital. And we now need concerted and sustained efforts across as much of their range as possible. And I hope you will join us in supporting these efforts. Thank you.